A pregnant woman stood alone in the freezing rain outside a closed shelter, her trembling hands wrapped around her swollen belly. No one stopped, no one looked, until a lone biker pulled over, a man with a scarred face and a promise he made 22 years ago to a dying friend. What began as a simple act of kindness on a cold November night would unravel a web of corruption, ignite a movement across 3 states, and force him to honor a vow he thought he'd never have to keep. By dawn, 83 bikers would roll into town. By the end of the week, the entire system would be exposed. This is the story of how one stop changed everything. The rain was relentless that night, hammering the asphalt like nails driven into wood. Sarah Colvin sat huddled beneath the narrow awning of the Mercy Point shelter, her jacket soaked through, her body shaking uncontrollably. 8 months pregnant, nowhere to go. The shelter had closed early. Budget cuts, they said through the locked glass door. The street was empty except for passing headlights that never slowed, their drivers looking straight ahead, pretending not to see her. She pressed her palms against her belly and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Promises about warmth, about safety, about a future that seemed impossible from where she sat, rain pooling around her worn sneakers. Then she heard it. The deep rumble of a motorcycle engine cutting through the rain like thunder rolling across distant hills. A lone rider pulled to the curb, his headlight illuminating the rain in silver streaks. Tall, broad-shouldered. His leather vest was worn and patched with emblems she couldn't quite make out in the darkness. His face was lined with old scars that caught the streetlight, and his eyes, when he looked at her, held something she hadn't seen in weeks: concern. He killed the engine and stepped off the bike, rain streaming down his face, soaking through his clothes. He didn't seem to notice. "You need help," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah looked up, too exhausted to be afraid, too cold to care anymore. Shelters closed. He crouched beside her, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that had talked people down from ledges and through firefights. "Name's Garrett Kane. I'm not leaving you out here. If you're watching this story unfold, stay with us, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity." Garrett Kane hadn't planned on stopping in Pine Ridge. He was riding through on his way to nowhere in particular, the way he'd lived for the past 2 decades since leaving the Marines. No routes, no plans, just the road stretching endlessly ahead and the weight of a promise he carried like a stone, lodged permanently in his chest, heavy and unmovable. 22 years ago, his best friend died in his arms on a dusty road outside Kandahar. Danny Mercer, a combat medic, a father to twin girls he'd never see grow up. A man who believed, even in the worst hell imaginable, that people were fundamentally worth saving. The IED had torn through their convoy without warning. Garrett had pulled Danny from the wreckage, dragging him to cover while rounds cracked overhead. He'd pressed his hands against the wounds, felt the hot blood pumping between his fingers, watched the light begin to fade from his friend's eyes. "If I don't make it back," Danny had whispered, each word costing him, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Promise me you'll look out for people who can't look out for themselves. Promise me you won't become hard. Promise me you won't forget what we're fighting for." Garrett had promised through tears and rage and helplessness. And he'd kept that promise in his own quiet way, helping stranded drivers on empty highways, intervening when he saw someone being hurt, offering cash to strangers in need. Small acts, silent gestures, nothing that made headlines or earned recognition, just a man trying to honor his word. But when he saw Sarah sitting in the rain that night, something deeper shifted inside him. Maybe it was the way her hands cradled her belly so protectively, as if she could shield her unborn child from the entire cruel world. Maybe it was the resignation in her eyes, not fear, but acceptance of suffering. Or maybe it was the voice in his head that sounded exactly like Danny's, clear as the day he died. "Don't just pass by, not this time." He pulled his phone from his vest with fingers still dripping rainwater and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered, suspicious of late-night calls. "Garrett? That you?" "Marcus. I need a favor. A big one." Marcus Holt ran a small motel on the edge of town, the Pine View Motor Lodge, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and didn't report to anyone, a place where people running from bad situations could catch their breath. Marcus was ex-army himself, had served 2 tours in Iraq, and understood the unspoken code between veterans. Within 20 minutes, Garrett had Sarah in a warm room with clean sheets, hot soup that Marcus's wife Elena brought up personally, and a promise that she could stay as long as she needed without anyone asking for money she didn't have. She sat on the edge of the bed, still shivering despite the heater running full blast, staring at Garrett like he was something impossible, a miracle she didn't believe in but desperately wanted to. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett adjusted his jacket, water still dripping onto the worn carpet, and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, not looking back. "Because someone did it for me once, and because I promised a good man I'd never stop trying." But as he stepped into the hallway, pulling the door quietly closed behind him, Marcus grabbed his arm with an urgent grip. "Garrett, wait. You need to know something." Marcus's face was tight with worry, the kind of expression that came from knowing bad news and having to deliver it. "That shelter didn't close because of budget cuts. That's the story they're telling, but it's bullshit." Garrett's jaw tightened. What really happened? "The director got arrested 2 days ago. Embezzlement, fraud, major operation. Word is, half the shelters in the county are tangled up in it. Money disappearing, records falsified, people getting rich while families freeze in the streets. What about the people who need help?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "They're out in the cold, and the state's doing nothing about it, saying they need to investigate thoroughly before reopening anything. Meanwhile, winter's coming, and people are suffering." "Udaim." Garrett stood in the dim hallway, rain drumming steadily against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. He thought about Sarah, about her unborn child, about the others like her scattered across the county with nowhere to turn. He thought about Danny, about promises kept, and systems that failed the people they were supposed to protect. He pulled out his phone again and scrolled to a name he hadn't contacted in years, a contact saved simply as Brotherhood. IRON Brotherhood, National Chapter. His thumbs moved across the screen. Need backup. Pine Ridge, Montana. Major corruption. People sleeping in the streets. Pregnant women. Kids. System completely failed. It's time to ride. He hit send and waited. By morning, the replies started coming in, one by one. Rider after rider. Brothers and sisters from chapters across the country. Chicago here. I'm in. Texas chapter rolling out at dawn. Brother, we ride. Give us 48 hours. Arizona, Ohio, standing by with supplies. You call, we answer. Nevada. The messages kept coming, filling his screen with pledges and commitments, each one representing riders who understood that some promises transcend distance and convenience. Garrett stood in the parking lot as dawn broke over the mountains, his phone still buzzing with incoming messages, and he allowed himself a small smile. Danny would have loved this. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through thin curtains, dust motes dancing in the golden light. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still trapped in the fog of exhaustion and cold. Then the memory came rushing back, the rain, the fear, the biker with the scarred face, the impossible kindness of a warm room. She sat up slowly, her belly heavy and awkward, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache. On the nightstand was a note written in rough, masculine handwriting that slanted slightly to the left. Stay as long as you need. Food's downstairs in the diner. Coffee's hot. You're safe here. No one's going to bother you. G. Beside the note was a $50 bill and a key to the room. She didn't cry often anymore. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that made survival harder. But she cried then, her body shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with the cold. Downstairs, the small diner attached to the motel smelled like bacon and fresh coffee. Marcus handed her a plate of eggs, toast, hash browns, and orange juice without a word, just a gentle nod that said everything words couldn't. The diner was mostly empty, except for a few truckers nursing coffee and reading newspapers, and a waitress named Betty, who smiled warmly when Sarah sat down. "Where is he?" Sarah asked after taking a few bites, surprised by how hungry she actually was. "Garrett? Out riding, making calls. He'll be back." Marcus poured her more orange juice and leaned against the counter. "You eat. You rest. Don't worry about anything else." "Why is he helping me? He doesn't even know me." Marcus was quiet for a moment, wiping down the counter in slow, methodical circles. "Garrett doesn't talk about it much, but he made a promise to a friend a long time ago, back when they were both serving overseas. That friend didn't make it home, and Garrett spent every day since trying to honor that promise, helping people who can't help themselves, standing up when nobody else will. He's the kind of man who keeps his word, even when it costs him." Sarah ate slowly, her mind racing through the past few weeks like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She'd been on the streets for 3 weeks, ever since her landlord evicted her for falling 2 months behind on rent after the warehouse where she worked suddenly closed, leaving 63 people unemployed with 2 days' notice. She'd applied for every form of assistance she could find, filled out forms until her hand cramped, waited in lines for hours only to be told to come back next week. The bureaucracy was endless, tangled in red tape and closed offices and caseworkers with impossible caseloads who looked at her with sympathy but no solutions. The shelter had been her last hope, and then it closed. "What really happened to the shelter?" she asked quietly, setting down her fork. Marcus's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Corruption. Deep corruption. The director was pocketing donations, falsifying records, creating fake expenses. State's investigating now, but in the meantime, people like you are left with absolutely nothing. No resources, no help, just closed doors and empty promises." Sarah's hands tightened around her fork until her knuckles went white. "So we just disappear? We don't matter?" "Not if Garrett has anything to say about it. And trust me, when Garrett decides something matters, he doesn't quit." That afternoon, Garrett returned. He wasn't alone. 3 motorcycles rolled into the motel parking lot, their engines growling in perfect unison like mechanical wolves. The riders dismounted with practiced ease, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing patched leather vests with the IRON Brotherhood emblem stitched across the back, a shield with crossed wrenches and the words "Loyalty, Honor, Brotherhood" curved beneath. Garrett greeted them with firm handshakes and quiet words Sarah couldn't hear from her window. Then he led them inside, their boots heavy on the wooden steps. Sarah watched from behind the curtain, her heart pounding with uncertainty and something that might have been hope. One of the riders, a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a braid and sharp, intelligent eyes, noticed her watching and smiled, the kind of smile that held both warmth and steel. "You must be Sarah," she said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Veronica Chen. We're here to help." "Help with what?" Veronica's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "With making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, with making sure the people responsible pay for what they've done, and with keeping you and your baby safe while we do it." Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this story reaches. That night, Garrett sat in the motel's cramped back office with Veronica, Marcus, and 2 other riders who'd arrived with her. A man named Cole Bishop, with a military bearing and calculating eyes, and a younger guy called Finn Murphy, who handled their communications and digital security. A laptop sat open on the scarred wooden desk, displaying a detailed map of Pine Ridge County with colored pins marking locations. "There are 4 homeless shelters in the county," Veronica said, clicking through files she'd compiled during the drive. 2 are closed pending investigation, Mercy Point and Cedar Valley. One's at maximum capacity and has been turning people away for 3 weeks. The last one's technically open, but they're operating on emergency funding that runs out in 10 days. What about state resources? Garrett asked, his voice tight. Tied up in bureaucracy and politics. The governor's office issued a statement 3 days ago saying they're reviewing the situation with appropriate concern and forming a task force. Meanwhile, people are sleeping in parks, under bridges, in their cars, if they're lucky enough to still have cars. Garrett's fists clenched on the desk. So we step in. How? Cole asked, his tactical mind already working through logistics. We're bikers, not social workers or housing authorities. We're both, Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. We mobilize. We put the word out through every chapter in the network. We bring supplies, set up temporary shelters, provide food and medical care, and make enough noise that the state can't ignore us anymore. We shine a light so bright on this situation that hiding becomes impossible. Finn leaned forward, his fingers already moving across his keyboard. You're talking about a full-scale operation. Media coverage, coordination across state lines, that's going to draw attention, good and bad. I'm talking about keeping a promise. Everything else is just details. Veronica studied him for a long moment, reading the determination in his scarred face, then nodded slowly. I'll send the call out tonight through the secure network. How many riders do you think we can get? Garrett pulled out his phone and opened the IRON Brotherhood network, a private encrypted channel connecting chapters across 12 states, from Washington to Texas, from California to Ohio. Thousands of riders who shared a code, loyalty to each other, service to those in need, and zero tolerance for injustice. He typed carefully, Pine Ridge, Montana, major corruption scandal. Homeless families, including pregnant women and children, sleeping in the cold while officials investigate. Shelters closed, state doing nothing. Need riders, need supplies, need voices loud enough to be heard. Who's standing with us? He hit send and set the phone down. Within 15 minutes, the first response came through. Chicago chapter here. Rolling out tomorrow morning with 3 trucks of supplies. Count us in. Then another. Texas crew standing by. We've got blankets, food, medical supplies ready to load. Give us a destination. Ohio Brotherhood ready to ride. 24 hours and we're there. Count Arizona in. We don't leave our own behind. By midnight, 83 riders from 7 states had committed to the rally, along with dozens of support vehicles, supply trucks, and volunteers. The operation was taking shape, faster than Garrett had dared hope. Finn pulled up a coordination spreadsheet, tracking arrivals and resources. This is incredible. I've never seen mobilization this fast. That's what Brotherhood means, Veronica said softly. Someone calls for help. Everyone answers. No questions, no hesitation. Garrett stared at the screen, watching the numbers grow, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like Danny's hand all those years ago. By dawn, the convoy would begin rolling toward Pine Ridge, and nothing would ever be the same. The sun barely kissed the horizon when the first rumble echoed through Pine Ridge, rolling down Main Street like approaching thunder. Low, deep, unstoppable. Garrett stood outside the motel, his arms crossed, watching the eastern road. Beside him, Sarah wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, despite the coat someone had given her the night before. Her eyes were wide with disbelief and something approaching awe. "What is that sound?" she whispered. "That," Garrett said, a faint smile crossing his scarred face for the first time in days, "is the sound of a promise being kept. That's the sound of people who refuse to look away." The first bike crested the hill, a chrome Harley-Davidson, with the IRON Brotherhood emblem gleaming on the tank, catching the early morning light like a beacon. Behind it came another, then a dozen more, stretching back along the highway in perfect formation. The convoy rolled into Pine Ridge like a tide of steel and thunder and absolute determination. 83 riders from 7 states, their engines synchronized in a chorus that shook windows and stopped traffic. Behind them came support vehicles, pickup trucks loaded with supplies, RVs converted into mobile command centers, trailers carrying tents and equipment. They parked in formation in the motel's large parking lot and the empty field beside it, engines cutting one by one, until the only sounds were wind whistling through the pines and the distant call of morning birds and the soft conversations of riders greeting each other like the family they were. Veronica stepped forward, climbing onto the bed of a pickup truck so everyone could see her. Her voice carried across the lot, strong and clear. "Brothers and sisters, we didn't ride hundreds of miles for a parade. We came because the system failed. We came because people are suffering while bureaucrats debate. We ride for those who have no voice. We ride for justice. We ride for Sarah and her baby. And we ride for every person this broken system left behind in the cold." The riders raised their fists in silent solidarity, a gesture that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She'd never seen anything like it. Never imagined that this many people, strangers really, would drop everything and travel across state lines because one man made a phone call, because one man decided someone mattered. Garrett placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. None of you are." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like hope. Within 3 hours, the parking lot and adjacent field transformed into an organized command center that would have impressed any military operation. Tents went up in neat rows. Sleeping quarters, medical station, food distribution, legal aid office, supply depot. Tables appeared, followed by chairs, generators, lights, heaters. Supplies were systematically unloaded from trucks, blankets still in packaging, winter coats in every size, boxes of non-perishable food, cases of water, medical kits that would stock a small clinic, hygiene products, diapers, formula, toys for children who'd had nothing to play with in weeks, a makeshift kitchen fired up under a large canopy tent, staffed by riders who'd worked as cooks and volunteers from town who showed up wanting to help. The smell of hot coffee, bacon, and fresh bread drifted across the camp. Real food, hot meals, dignity. Veronica coordinated operations from a folding table covered in maps, lists, schedules, and a laptop tracking everything in real time. Cole and Finn worked crowd control and security, making sure everything stayed safe and organized as word spread through town and people began arriving. Hesitantly at first, then in growing numbers, as they realized this wasn't some temporary gesture, but a genuine commitment. Marcus opened the motel's conference room for private consultations. Lawyers who rode with the Brotherhood offered free legal advice. Nurses and EMTs set up the medical tent. Social workers helped people navigate the bureaucracy that had defeated them before. And Garrett moved through it all quietly, shaking hands, crouching down to talk to children at eye level, listening to stories of loss and struggle and survival. He didn't give speeches, didn't seek cameras, just offered presence and attention and the message that someone finally cared. One woman approached him late that afternoon, her 2 young children clinging to her legs, their faces smudged with dirt, but their eyes bright with cautious hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking despite her effort to stay strong. "I've been trying to get help for 6 weeks. I filled out every form, waited in every line, called every number. No one would listen. Everyone said to wait, to be patient, that they were working on it. But my kids were hungry and cold, and I didn't know what else to do." Garrett crouched down to meet her eyes, his voice gentle. "We're listening now, and we're not going anywhere until everyone here has what they need. That's a promise." By noon, the local news arrived. Cameras, reporters, microphones, questions shouted across the crowd. A young reporter with ambitious eyes pushed through to where Garrett stood, coordinating supply distribution. "Mr. Kane, I'm Jessica Martin from KPNW News. Can you tell our viewers what's happening here?" Garrett straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, and faced the camera with the same steady calm he'd carried into combat zones. "We're here because the system failed these people. We're here because families are suffering while politicians issue statements and form committees. We're here because nobody else would do what needed to be done. And we're here to demand accountability from everyone who let this happen." The reporter pressed forward. "What specifically do you want from state officials?" "Transparency about where the money went and who knew about it, immediate action to reopen shelters with proper oversight, and a guarantee that no one else will be left in the rain while the people responsible for protecting them steal from the most vulnerable. That's not complicated. That's basic human decency." The interview aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news. By 8 it had been picked up by regional outlets. By midnight it was trending on social media with hashtags like #Pine Ridge Promise and #Biker Justice. The story was spreading, and with it came both support and resistance. If this story is moving you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to remember the good people still exist. The rally drew attention across the state and beyond, but not all of it was welcome. Not everyone wanted the truth exposed. 2 days after the convoy arrived, a sleek black SUV with government plates pulled into the camp. 3 men in expensive suits stepped out, flashing state credentials with an air of authority meant to intimidate. "We need to speak with whoever's in charge here," the lead agent said, his tone clipped and cold, eyes scanning the camp with obvious disapproval. Garrett met them at the edge of the perimeter, flanked by Veronica and Cole. Behind them, other riders casually positioned themselves within view, not threatening, just present and watchful. "I'm Garrett Kane. What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The agent's eyes narrowed, assessing Garrett with the calculation of someone used to controlling situations. "I'm Special Agent Richard Caldwell, State Bureau of Investigation. You're interfering with an ongoing investigation. We're providing aid to people your system abandoned. Last I checked, that's not a crime. This is a state matter that requires careful handling. Your presence here is complicating a sensitive situation. Then the state should have handled it before families ended up sleeping in the streets." Garrett's voice remained level, but steel ran through every word. "We're filling a gap you left open." Caldwell stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone meant to sound reasonable, but coming across as threatening. "Mr. Kane, I suggest you and your friends pack up and leave town before this becomes a legal issue. We can find violations if we need to. Permits, health codes, public assembly regulations. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Garrett didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't break eye contact. "We're not going anywhere until those shelters reopen with proper oversight and every person here has a safe place to go. You can investigate us all you want. We're not hiding anything. Can you say the same?" The tension hung thick in the cold air, neither man backing down. Cole's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his phone, ready to document anything that happened next. Finally, Caldwell stepped back with a tight smile that held no warmth. "You've been warned, Mr. Kane. Don't say we didn't try to handle this civilly." The agents left, but Garrett knew with absolute certainty it wasn't over. The system didn't like being challenged. People with secrets fought back when threatened with exposure. That night, security around the camp doubled. Riders volunteered for watch shifts, walking the perimeter in pairs, ensuring everyone inside stayed safe. Garrett sat in the command tent, going through supply lists and coordination schedules, when his phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Kane?" A woman's voice, nervous and hurried. "Who's this?" "My name is Dr. Elena Ruiz. I used to work for Pine Ridge County's Department of Social Services as a senior program coordinator. I was fired 2 months ago for asking too many questions about budget discrepancies." Garrett's pulse quickened. He gestured for Veronica to come closer, putting the phone on speaker. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about where the federal funding was really going. Why shelter budgets kept getting cut while administrative costs somehow increased. My contracts kept going to the same companies regardless of performance. I started digging into financial records, and suddenly I was accused of insubordination and terminated. But I kept copies of everything. What do you have? Documents, emails, invoices, bank transfers. The corruption goes much deeper than just the shelter director, Mr. Kane. This involves county supervisors, state housing officials, and contractors operating what amounts to a coordinated fraud scheme, stealing from homeless assistance programs. Can you prove it? I can. But I need protection. After I was fired, someone broke into my apartment. My car was vandalized. I've received anonymous calls telling me to keep quiet if I know what's good for me. I'm scared, but I can't stay silent anymore. These are real people suffering while corrupt officials get rich. Garrett glanced at the camp through the tent opening, at the families sleeping safely for the first time in weeks, at the children finally playing instead of crying, at Sarah resting in the warm motel with her unborn child protected. Dr. Ruiz, where are you right now? At a friend's house in Helena. I can be there in 3 hours. Come to the Pineview Motor Lodge. Ask for Marcus at the front desk. We'll have people watching for you. You'll be safe here. I give you my word. Thank you, Mr. Kane. I just want to do the right thing. That makes 2 of us. Drive carefully and call me when you're close. He ended the call and looked at Veronica, whose expression had shifted into something hard and determined. This is exactly what we needed. It's also going to make us an even bigger target, Cole added, from where he'd been listening. If there's this much corruption, they won't let it go public without a fight. Then we'd better be ready, Garrett said quietly. Because we're about to expose everything. Dr. Elena Ruiz arrived at the motel just before dawn, her hands shaking as she clutched a leather messenger bag containing a flash drive that held enough evidence to destroy careers and send people to federal prison. Garrett, Veronica, Marcus, and Finn gathered in the back office, the door locked, blinds drawn, and a white noise generator running to prevent any electronic surveillance. Elena plugged the drive into Finn's laptop, which was isolated from any network and running security protocols that would detect any attempts to trace or hack. Files opened on the screen, hundreds of them, meticulously organized into folders labeled by year, department, and type of violation. This, Elena said, her voice steadier now that she was finally able to show someone what she'd discovered, is proof that Pine Ridge County systematically diverted federal homelessness prevention funds into private accounts over a 3-year period. The shelter closures weren't about budget cuts or mismanagement. They were deliberate cover-ups to hide the theft. Veronica leaned closer, her eyes scanning the financial records. How much money are we talking about? Over $2.4 million, federal grants that were supposed to fund shelters, provide rental assistance, offer job training programs, supply mental health services, all of it either stolen outright or funneled through fake contractors who kicked back percentages to officials. Garrett's jaw tightened as he scrolled through email chains, showing county supervisors discussing how to hide transactions, joking about managing the optics, while real people suffered from their greed. Who's involved? Elena pulled up an organizational chart she'd created. 3 county supervisors, including the board chairman, the county treasurer, 2 state housing officials who approved fraudulent grant applications, and most importantly, a non-profit called Mountain West Community Development that doesn't actually exist. It's just a shell company with a fake board and no actual operations. Money goes in, gets laundered through various accounts, and comes out in places it was never supposed to go. Marcus exhaled sharply, his combat veteran's mind already seeing the tactical implications. This is bigger than anyone thought. These aren't just local officials padding expenses. This is organized fraud at multiple levels of government, which is exactly why they'll fight back with everything they have, Elena said quietly, fear flickering across her face despite her courage in coming forward. I've already received threats. My car was vandalized 3 times. Someone broke into my apartment and went through my files, though they didn't know I'd already backed everything up in multiple locations. A former colleague warned me that people are looking for me. Garrett met her eyes with absolute certainty. You're safe here. We've got security around this entire camp 24/7. No one's getting to you. You did the right thing bringing this forward. What do we do with all this evidence? Veronica asked, her mind already working through options. We go nuclear, Finn said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. We don't release it to one outlet or agency. We send it everywhere simultaneously so it can't be buried or spun. Major newspapers, investigative journalists, federal oversight agencies, anti-corruption organizations, every media outlet in the state. We make it impossible to contain. How long will that take? Garrett asked. Give me 6 hours to verify everything's properly anonymized and protected, set up secure upload protocols, and compile the full distribution list. Then we push it all at once. Garrett nodded. Do it. And Elena, thank you. This took real courage. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Those people out there deserve better. They didn't do anything wrong except be poor at the wrong time. While they suffered, people who were supposed to help them bought vacation homes and luxury cars. That's not just corruption, that's evil. By noon, the files were ready. Finn had created an encrypted package containing all the evidence, complete with Elena's detailed analysis explaining exactly what each document proved and how the fraud operated. He'd compiled a list of 73 recipients ranging from the New York Times to local Montana papers, from federal investigators to state legislators known for their anti-corruption stances. Ready? Finn asked, his cursor hovering over the send button. Garrett looked around the room, at the people who'd become his team, his family in this fight. Then he thought about Sarah and her unborn child, about the woman with 2 kids who'd thanked him for listening, about every person who'd been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Send it. Finn clicked the button. Within minutes, the files began arriving in inboxes across the country. Within an hour, phones started ringing in government offices as journalists called for comment. Within 3 hours, the first headlines began to break. Multi-million-dollar fraud scheme exposed in Montana. Homeless services, federal investigation launched after biker group uncovers massive corruption documents reveal systematic theft from programs meant to help vulnerable populations. Pine Ridge County officials face accusations of coordinated fraud. By evening, it was the lead story on every major news outlet in Montana and gaining national attention. News vans descended on Pine Ridge. Reporters camped outside the county courthouse. Phone lines to government offices were jammed with angry constituents demanding answers. The story was out. The truth was exposed, and there was no putting it back in the box. The backlash came swiftly and from multiple directions, exactly as expected. County officials held an emergency press conference denying all allegations and calling the documents fabricated by radical elements seeking to undermine legitimate government functions. State representatives issued careful statements calling for calm and due process, while quietly distancing themselves from anyone named in the evidence. Lawyers for the accused officials threatened defamation lawsuits against the media outlets that published the story, but the evidence was too solid, too detailed, too undeniable. Federal investigators from 3 agencies descended on Pine Ridge. Grand juries were convened, subpoenas were issued, bank records were frozen. The machine of justice, once set in motion, proved difficult to stop, and the convoy wasn't backing down. If anything, the exposure strengthened their resolve. On the 7th day after the convoy's arrival, over 300 people gathered at the Pine Ridge County Courthouse. Riders from the Brotherhood, volunteers who'd joined the camp, families who'd been helped, community members outraged by the corruption, and concerned citizens who'd driven from across the state to stand in solidarity. They held signs demanding accountability. They chanted for justice. They refused to be silent or intimidated. Garrett stood on the courthouse steps, a megaphone in his weathered hand, looking out at the sea of faces representing something larger than any individual, the power of people refusing to accept injustice. "We came to this town for one reason," he said, his voice echoing across the square and carrying to the news cameras broadcasting live to viewers across the state. "To help people the system forgot, to offer shelter to those left in the cold, to stand with the vulnerable when no one else would. But what we found here was something darker. We found corruption. We found greed. We found people in positions of trust stealing from those who had nothing while pretending to serve the public good." The crowd's response was immediate and loud, anger and agreement mixing into something powerful. "We're not lawyers or politicians or investigators," Garrett continued. "We're just people who believe that keeping promises matters, that standing up for what's right matters, that protecting the vulnerable matters. And we're not leaving until every person responsible for this theft, this betrayal of public trust, is held fully accountable under the law." The roar from the crowd shook the courthouse windows. Inside, county officials scrambled. Emergency meetings were called. Lawyers were consulted at exorbitant hourly rates. Phone calls flew between offices, trying to coordinate responses and minimize damage. By noon, the state attorney general held her own press conference, announcing the formation of a special task force and promising thorough investigation with appropriate consequences for anyone found guilty of misconduct. It was the kind of careful political language designed to appear responsive without committing to anything specific. But by evening, the pressure had grown too intense to resist. Federal agents arrested the county board chairman at his home. The treasurer turned himself in after his lawyer negotiated surrender terms. 2 state housing officials were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The fake non-profits' bank accounts were seized. Subpoenas went out to dozens of other individuals and organizations connected to the scheme. Sarah stood beside Garrett on the courthouse steps, her hand resting protectively on her belly, tears streaming down her face as she watched justice finally beginning to take shape. "You did this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You changed everything." Garrett shook his head, his scarred face reflecting the late afternoon sun. "We did this, all of us together. That's the only way real change happens. When people refuse to look away and decide that enough is enough." That night, the camp celebrated quietly, not with triumph or gloating, but with the deep satisfaction of knowing they'd made a difference, that they'd stood up when it mattered, that promises kept and sacrifices made had resulted in real, tangible change. But Garrett sat apart from the celebration, looking up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky, thinking about Danny and the promise made on a dusty road half a world away. "I kept my word, brother," he thought. "Still keeping it. Always will." 3 weeks later, the Mercy Point shelter reopened under completely new management, fully funded through a combination of emergency state allocations and federal grants that were now subject to unprecedented oversight and transparency requirements. 2 additional shelters were established in other parts of the county using seized assets from the fraud investigation. A statewide housing initiative was fast-tracked through the legislature, creating new protections and accountability measures for all programs serving vulnerable populations. The reforms wouldn't solve everything overnight. Systems that had been broken for years wouldn't heal instantly, but it was a beginning, a genuine, meaningful beginning that wouldn't have happened without exposure, pressure, and people willing to stand up. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a cold December morning. The labor lasted 14 hours, and when it was over, she held her daughter with tears of joy, replacing all the tears of fear she'd cried in the preceding months. She named her Hope Elena Kane, hope for the future she could now imagine, Elena for the woman whose courage exposed the truth, and Kane for the man who'd stopped when everyone else kept driving. Garrett visited her in the hospital, holding the tiny newborn in his scarred hands with surprising gentleness. The baby's small fingers curled around his thumb, gripping with the fierce determination of new life, refusing to let go. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, exhausted but radiant, "for everything, for stopping, for caring, for fighting, for showing me that good people still exist in this world." Garrett looked down at Hope, her face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the journey her mother had traveled to bring her safely into the world. He thought about Danny's twin daughters, who'd grown up without their father, about promises that transcended time and circumstances, about the power of one person choosing to act when action was needed most. "I just kept my word," he said quietly. "That's all any of us can do, keep the promises we make and stand up when we're needed." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're her godfather, you know. I don't care if you planned on it or not. You're family now." Garrett felt emotion tighten his throat, an unfamiliar sensation for someone who'd spent years keeping everyone at arm's length. "I'd be honored." Outside the hospital, the Iron Brotherhood prepared to ride again. 83 bikers who'd dropped everything to answer a call, support volunteers who'd given weeks of their time, people who'd proven that solidarity and compassion weren't just abstract concepts, but real forces that could change lives and challenge systems. Veronica found Garrett in the hospital parking lot, looking out at the mountains where snow was beginning to dust the peaks. "We did good work here," she said simply. "We did. But there are a lot of other Pine Ridges out there, a lot of other Sarahs, a lot of systems that need challenging." She smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "So, where to next?" Garrett thought about the question, about open roads and unfinished promises, about the call that would inevitably come from somewhere else where people needed help and systems had failed. "Wherever the road takes us," he said, "wherever we're needed." The convoy rolled out the next morning as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Engines roared to life in synchronized thunder. Riders mounted up, checking gear and exchanging final words with volunteers, staying behind to help with ongoing operations. Sarah stood at the motel entrance with Hope wrapped in warm blankets, watching them prepare to leave. She felt a complex mix of gratitude, sadness at their departure, and something deeper, the knowledge that she'd witnessed something rare and beautiful. People choosing to be better, choosing to act instead of looking away, choosing to keep promises even when it cost them. Garrett approached for a final goodbye, his helmet under one arm. "You're going to be fine," he said with certainty. "You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. There are people here now who'll help you. The Brotherhood has a number you can call any time, anywhere if you need anything. We don't forget our family. Will I see you again?" He smiled slightly. "Probably. The road tends to circle back eventually. And I want to watch Hope grow up. See what kind of person she becomes with a mother like you." Sarah hugged him tightly, this scarred stranger who'd become so much more. "Thank you for believing I mattered, for believing any of us mattered. You always mattered. Someone just needed to prove it." Garrett mounted his bike, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. He looked back one last time at the motel, at the town, at the people they'd helped. Then he joined the formation, and the convoy began to move. They rode out of Pine Ridge the same way they'd arrived, as a force of steel and purpose and unwavering determination. The sound of their engines echoed off the mountains and faded gradually into the distance as they disappeared down the highway toward whatever waited ahead. Marcus stood beside Sarah, watching them go. "Hell of a thing, wasn't it?" he said quietly. "Yeah," Sarah agreed, tears running down her cheeks as she held Hope closer. "Hell of a thing." In the motel office, a map hung on the wall, with pins marking places the Brotherhood had been, lives they'd touched, promises they'd kept. Marcus added a new pin to Pine Ridge, writing beside it, "Sarah and Hope, November 2025. Promise kept. Because some promises never die, some riders never stop. And somewhere out there, on some rainy night or desperate moment, someone else would need help. And the call would go out, and the Brotherhood would answer, because that's what family does." That's what honor demands. That's what promises mean when they're made by people who understand that words without action are just empty noise. Dr. Elena Ruiz found new work with a federal oversight agency, using her experience to help design better accountability systems for social service programs nationwide. Her testimony would be crucial in multiple prosecutions. The 3 county supervisors were convicted on federal fraud charges and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 7 to 12 years. The fake nonprofits operators faced similar fates. Civil lawsuits recovered over 60% of the stolen funds, which were redirected to actual homeless services with ironclad oversight. The shelter director who'd initially been arrested turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimony about how the scheme operated in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation exposed corruption in 3 other Montana counties, triggering a wave of investigations and reforms. But more than the legal victories or recovered funds, something else changed in Pine Ridge. The community had seen what was possible when people refused to accept injustice. Local volunteer organizations grew stronger. Citizen oversight committees formed to monitor government spending. People paid attention in ways they hadn't before, asking questions and demanding transparency. Sarah got her GED while caring for Hope, then enrolled in community college courses online. She wanted to become a social worker herself, to help other people the way she'd been helped, to be part of the solution instead of just surviving the problem. On Hope's first birthday, Garrett returned to Pine Ridge. He'd been in California helping with wildfire relief, then Nevada assisting with a labor rights campaign, then Arizona supporting a veterans housing project. The road had taken him to a dozen places where people needed help and promises needed keeping. But he'd promised Sarah he'd be there for Hope's first birthday, and Garrett Kane kept his promises. The party was small but filled with warmth. Sarah's new friends from the shelter support group she'd joined, Marcus and his wife, a few neighbors, and Veronica, who'd driven up from Wyoming where she was coordinating a new Brotherhood chapter. Hope toddled unsteadily across the floor of Sarah's small but clean apartment, subsidized housing she'd qualified for through one of the new programs established after the scandal. She was healthy, happy, and blissfully unaware of the journey that had brought her into the world. When she saw Garrett, she smiled and reached up with chubby arms, recognizing him somehow despite the months apart. He picked her up, and she grabbed his beard with determined curiosity. "She's got your stubbornness," Garrett told Sarah with a rare, genuine laugh. "Good, she's going to need it." That evening, after the cake was eaten and presents opened and guests had left, Garrett sat on Sarah's small balcony, looking out at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. Sarah joined him, bringing coffee. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "I don't think I can ever thank you enough. You don't need to. Seeing you and Hope happy and safe, that's all the thanks I need." "Why do you do it, really? You could have just kept riding that night. Nobody would have blamed you." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, watching the light fade from the sky. "I made a promise to my best friend before he died. He made me promise I wouldn't become hard, that I'd keep looking out for people who needed help. At the time, I thought it was just about small gestures, helping someone change a tire, buying a meal for someone hungry. But I've learned it's bigger than that. It's about refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable, or that systems can't be changed. It's about keeping your word even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. He'd be proud of you. I hope so. I think about him every day. Wonder what he'd say about all this." Sarah smiled. "I think he'd say you kept your promise, and that it mattered." Inside, Hope was playing with blocks, building towers, and knocking them down with delighted laughter. The sound drifted out to the balcony, pure joy, innocent and perfect. "She'll never know how close things came to being completely different," Sarah said quietly, "if you hadn't stopped that night. But I did, and you survived, and she's here. That's what matters. Not what might have been, but what is." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over Pine Ridge and stars began emerging in the vast Montana sky. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of motorcycles rumbled past. Not the Brotherhood, just regular riders enjoying the evening. But the sound still carried meaning, still represented possibility and freedom, and the open road where promises were kept and lives were changed. Garrett's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, a request from Idaho. Something about a mining company violating safety regulations and workers needing support organizing. The kind of situation where outside pressure might make a difference. "You're leaving again," Sarah said, reading his expression. "Tomorrow morning, but I'll be back for Christmas. That's a promise." "I know. You keep your promises." He stood, preparing to head to the motel where he'd reserved a room for the night. Sarah stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Garrett, when Hope's old enough to understand, I'm going to tell her about you, about what you did, about what real heroism looks like. Not the movie kind, but the kind that stops for someone in the rain, the kind that keeps promises even when nobody's watching." Garrett's throat tightened with emotion he didn't quite know how to express. Just teach her to be kind, to stand up for people who need it, to keep her word. That's all that matters. "I will. I promise." He smiled at that. Another promise, another link in an endless chain of people choosing to be better, to do better, to honor the commitments they made to each other and themselves. The next morning, Garrett rolled out of Pine Ridge as the sun rose over the mountains. His bike hummed beneath him, responsive and familiar. The road stretched ahead, full of unknowns and certainties both. He thought about Sarah and Hope, safe and thriving. About Elena's courage in exposing corruption. About the 83 riders who dropped everything to answer a call. About Marcus opening his motel to someone who needed shelter. About Veronica's fierce dedication to justice. About every small act of kindness and courage that had combined to create real, meaningful change. And he thought about Danny, whose promise had started all of this 22 years ago on a dusty road in a war zone half a world away. "I'm still keeping it, brother," Garrett thought, the wind rushing past as he accelerated into a curve, still fighting, still standing up, still refusing to look away when people need help. "And I'll keep doing it until I can't anymore. Because that's what you asked, that's what I promised, and promises matter." The road ahead split into options: north toward Idaho and the mining situation, west toward Oregon, where another chapter was dealing with something complicated, east back toward old territory. Each direction held possibility. Each represented someone who might need help, some promise waiting to be kept. Garrett chose north, leaning into the turn, feeling the power of the machine beneath him and the purpose driving him forward, because there would always be another Pine Ridge, another Sarah, another system that needed challenging, another promise that needed keeping. And as long as there were people willing to stop instead of passing by, willing to stand up instead of looking away, willing to keep their word even when it cost them something, there was hope, real hope, the kind that built better tomorrows instead of just surviving today. The kind of hope worth riding for, the kind worth fighting for, the kind worth keeping promises for. Behind him, Pine Ridge continued its morning routine, Hope laughing as Sarah made breakfast, Elena preparing testimony for another trial, Marcus greeting new guests who needed temporary shelter, Veronica coordinating with chapters across the region, and countless others living lives that had been touched, changed, and improved by people who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. Ahead of him, the road stretched endlessly toward whatever came next. And Garrett Kane rode on, a man defined not by his scars or his past, but by the promises he kept and the lives he touched, and the quiet, persistent determination to be better than the world sometimes demanded. Because some promises never die, some riders never stop, and some acts of kindness on cold, rainy nights echo forward through time, changing not just one life, but dozens, hundreds, potentially thousands as ripples spread outward in ways no one can fully predict or measure. That's the power of keeping your word. That's the meaning of real heroism. That's what Danny knew, and what Garrett learned, and what Hope would someday understand when her mother told her the story of the rainy night that changed everything, the story of a promise kept, the story of a biker who stopped, the story of how one person choosing to act can set in motion forces that transform systems, expose corruption, inspire courage, and prove that individual choices matter more than anyone wants to believe. The engine hummed, the road stretched ahead, the promise endured, and somewhere, someday, another call would come, and the Brotherhood would answer. Because that's what family does. Thank you for watching this story of courage, justice, and promises kept. If it moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist and that individual actions can change the world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of real heroism and human compassion. Until next time, ride safe, stand strong, and always keep your promises. They matter more than you know.